Merry Christmas and Merry Smithmas, because Joseph Smith was born on the 23rd of December 1805, and so that date is affectionately referred to as Smithmas, along with Christmas, which is just a couple of days later. I'm Ganesh Chair, and I'll be taking you through the life of Joseph Smith so that you can understand exactly what made him tick and what transpired to this movement, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that came from his understanding of God and Jesus, and the way that religion was playing out in his life in early 19th century America. Behind me is the cover to this book, Joseph Smith and the Beginning of Mormonism, written by Richard L. Bushman back in 1984, and it is a pivotal work talking about the beginnings of Joseph Smith's life and how it influenced his movement. Faithful Latter-day Saints will recognize Bushman's name because he then went on to produce another biography in 2005 called Rough Stone Rolling, which has become quite pivotal in talking about Joseph Smith and all of his facets. And that is an extended version of this particular work that he did back in 1984. Joseph's life is fascinating for a number of reasons. One, because it went on to produce an incredible church, but also because he encompassed so much of what early 19th century America were battling with regard to how life was and what it all meant, particularly for a new republic who was trying to make its way in the international world. Joseph Smith was born in Sharon, Vermont, in New England, and he came from a multi-generational family which had ties and deep roots to that particular part of the United States. One of the first things to know about Joseph Smith is that he was extremely poor. His family were in desperate circumstances in Palmyra, New York, but this wasn't always the case. He came from some quite good, well-to-do stock in New England, and the only reason he ended up in kind of poverty in Palmyra was because his father did some merchant speculation and lost the family fortune. And then there was a volcanic eruption in Indonesia that caused a summer without any sunlight, which meant that there was famine pretty much in New England, in which case lots of New England refugees fled the area and went to more fertile and warmer western New York, where they tried to make a new life. This all happened when Joseph was about 11 or 12 years old and still recovering from leg surgery that left him quite lame and limp. And his family did fairly well initially in western New York, in Palmyra, in Manchester, and seemed to be going really well till their brother Alvin died. Joseph Smith Sr. wasn't a particularly good provider, and so Alvin, the oldest brother, had taken the charge of looking after the family, and his untimely death plunged the family back into financial instability, particularly after they lost their family farm. This meant that Joseph's circumstances in his late teenage years were ones of quite desperation. Things were not going well for the family, and yet they had this stock, this belief in themselves as somebody quite special because their family circumstances before in New England had been quite good. They had come from money, they had come from education, they had come from prestige, and now they were plunged into the terrible circumstance of being poor, of not being able to have access to education, and where they weren't well respected in their community. And this is the backdrop by which the Book of Mormon came forth, with Joseph Smith in his particular area in Palmyra, New York. So we're going to look at Joseph's life in depth, looking at his environment, looking at the political and social and economic circumstances of his day, and what ended up being the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's going to be a wild ride. Enjoy. In my last video, I talked about this book, Joseph Smith and the Beginning of Mormonism by Richard L. Bushman. And I thought it might be useful to talk about some of the resources available to learn about Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Ganesh Chair, and I have a fascination for Joseph Smith and his life, which I'm hoping to share with you through these videos. This particular book has a really interesting history because many of you will recognize the name Richard Bushman as being the author of Rough Stone Rolling in 2005. But long before he wrote that book, he wrote this one in 1984. It's actually published by the University of Illinois Press, and here's my well-worn copy here. But it's a bit of a scandal that it's not published by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that is a really fascinating story. Initially, it was supposed to be. When Joseph Fielding Smith became president of the Church of Jesus Christ, he had been the church historian for the previous 50 years. And in 1972, Leonard Arrington was appointed to be church historian, and he was an actual historian, not just a member of the Smith family or somebody really interested in heritage. He really liked to know the details about what happened. And so he produced a number of works during his time as church historian, including a seminal biography and account of the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This was called The Story of the Latter-day Saints. Here is my copy here, and it's an incredible work because it was the first time that the church looked at doing something from a history point of view rather than a faithful, religious point of view. And this seated the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its beginnings in early 19th century America amongst revival culture and also the coming forth of the Republic of the United States. The book was written by James Allen and Glenn Leonard, who were both faithful members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they were also academic, and they also wrote it from a point of view of history. And so it revealed a number of things about the church previously unknown to most members. But it was very well received, and it was done in a careful, cautious way. And so it gave Leonard Arrington at least some idea that the saints could withstand some intellectual scrutiny, some historical analysis, and also some reality checks. So Richard Bushman, who was a faithful member, an academic, and an already regarded American historian, suggested to Leonard Arrington that a multi-volume series about the church would be really useful, and to include different scholars from outside the core church that could speak on various aspects of both Joseph Smith's life and then the church going forward into the new millennia. Richard Bushman produced his work on the founding, so the beginning from Joseph Smith's birth right through to basically the beginning of the church in 1830. And other scholars took on other parts of the church's history. But when general authorities who were over the church history department started to read these biographies and accounts, they started to become quite alarmed because Richard Bushman included a number of facets of Joseph Smith's early life, including his treasure seeking, in the pages of his book about Joseph Smith. This started to worry the brethren, and so they scrapped the whole project, basically demoted Leonard Arrington and kicked him out of being the church historian. And so those scholars who had produced these works then published them independently and without the church's sanction. And so Joseph Smith and the Beginning of Mormonism, written by Richard Bushman, was published in 1984, and very little press was given to it by the church because it didn't represent a authorized narrative. But in the wake of an internet age, a lot of these facts about Joseph Smith couldn't be suppressed any longer, and the church needed to figure out a way to present these to the membership. And so they asked Richard Bushman to expand his volume and create Rough Stone Rolling, which was published in 2005. And this has caused all kinds of problems because, of course, even though it's 20 years later, people still weren't prepared for this information because it had been suppressed back in 1982. The church then went on under Richard Turley as assistant church historian to produce the Saints volumes, which now kind of talk about this multi-volume history of the church with a more historical lens. This particular volume was done kind of at a high school reading age, and allowing other people to tell a more full account through other particular books. Dan Vogel did this excellent biography on the early part of Joseph Smith's life called Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet, also published in 2005. And if you're wanting something substantial, I would suggest his next work, Charisma Under Pressure, which was published last year, and detailing Joseph Smith's life between 1831 and 1839. And for the Nauvoo area, I would recommend this book, Kingdom of Nauvoo by Benjamin Park, which was published a few years ago. And this really goes into the details of what happens in Nauvoo for Joseph and how this impacts the church. But I would still highly recommend this 1984 book by Bushman because it's such a great read, really easy, engaging, really sets the scene with various parts of the American experience woven into Joseph Smith's life. It's a much easier read than Rough Stone Rolling in 2005, which kind of crams in a lot of understanding with not a great narrative style. So I hope that gives you a good start if you want to read something in depth, but I'll be going through a number of things and highlighting them with my knowledge from these particular works. In my last video, I talked about some Joseph Smith biographies and some church history accounts that may be useful to be able to unravel what Joseph's life was about. There are a couple of other really important resources that we have, and one of them is the history of Joseph Smith by his mother. And this was an account given in 1845, so the year after Joseph was killed, and his mother gave an account of the family and their history, including Joseph Smith's life and how the church came about. This is the greatest single resource we have on Joseph Smith by somebody who knew him, who loved him, who was appreciative of him, and also was able to give us some background about the family and how the dynamics worked prior to Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. But it is a later account in 1845, and so it has some significant bias, but that at least gives us some understanding of some of the events in the Smith household prior to Joseph Smith getting famous. And this is a big deal because Joseph never recorded anything about his life prior to 1829, prior to dictating the Book of Mormon, which means there's nothing in his hand that suggests anything about his life other than what other people tell us and what he says later about his own life. There is one important exception, and that is Joseph Smith's 1826 trial for his glass looking, because that is the only document we have that's about Joseph from that time period prior to him being anything more than just a lowly farm boy. And this was discovered much later, even though the trial was kind of known. And so these give some important reminiscence about Joseph, including his treasure seeking in Harmony, Pennsylvania with Josiah Stoll. Another fabulous resource we have is early Mormon documents produced by Dan Vogel. He went through and got everything that had been written about Joseph later, of course, because until he was famous, nobody really talked about Joseph, but then compiled that into sections so that you could get an understanding of what his neighbors, his extended family, his community, the people in Harmony, as well as Emma's extended family, felt about Joseph. Now, these have bias as well, of course, because some of these people didn't like Joseph or had been hurt by him, but it gives us a good understanding of some of the issues that Joseph presented to the people around him. And you can cross-reference a number of accounts so that you get a good idea of what are the issues that are going on for Joseph prior to the Book of Mormon. It's from these accounts that we understand most about the treasure digging understanding and lore that pervaded Joseph Smith's folk magic, and that this had a bearing on what ended up in the Book of Mormon. Because I believe that the Book of Mormon is also autobiographical, Joseph wrote into it some of his experiences, and you can cross-reference them with some of the accounts and references from people in his life talking about him later. This is really important because you can kind of reconstruct some of Joseph's experiences from the Book of Mormon that are not told by his mother, Lucy. and perhaps even infer some of the things that he's thinking about, because they end up in the pages of the Book of Mormon, along with some of the reminiscences that other people have of him. Now, all of these resources are available online, both on the Joseph Smith's Papers Project in relation to the 1826 trial, and the biography of Lucy Mack Smith and her history. But also the early Mormon documents are available on archive, and you can go and read them for free. So everything is there at your fingertips if you want to look at some of these contemporary accounts. Latter-day Saints know almost nothing about Joseph Smith. They know maybe a couple of things. One is that he had a first vision where he saw God and Jesus in 1820, that he got visited by an angel, Moroni, in 1823, that he retrieved some golden plates and published the Book of Mormon in 1830 and began a church. But apart from those three things, not a lot extra. They might know about his leg surgery when he was 7 years old, and they might know that he moved from Vermont through to Western New York in his early years, 12, 13 years old. And if they're really lucky, they know that he was born on the 23rd of December, 1805, to Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack. But what they don't know is that the Smiths had been in the Americas for centuries. Robert Smith came to Topsfield, Massachusetts in 1638, almost 150 years prior to the Declaration of Independence. Joseph Smith Jr. was a sixth generation New England citizen. Both of his grandfathers fought in the Revolutionary War, and his maternal grandfather, Solomon Mack, served in the French and Indian Wars. The Smith family were deeply patriotic. They were there from the inception of the United States. They had lived through the War of 1812, which is also known as the Second Revolutionary War, and this happened in Joseph's lifetime when he was a boy recovering from leg surgery, and it happened in his backyard in New England. His extended family were well-to-do. His grandfathers both wrote books, talked about their exploits in various wars, and were responsible for a lot of understanding about religious environment and national pride. Emma's family were also deeply patriotic. Emma's father, Isaac Hale, had served in the Revolutionary War, and he had kind of almost started from scratch in Harmony, Pennsylvania, with the help of Indians. And this is really important because all of these kinds of features about American exceptionalism, about war, about interaction between Indians were part of Joseph's life, part of his family folklore, part of Emma's family folklore, and this was woven into the Book of Mormon with regard to the idea of separation of church and state, of the idea of America as exceptional, and of course the idea that America was prized as a chosen land free from the bondage of kings, because it was a republic formed on the basis of voting democracy. This is the backdrop of Joseph Smith's life, and it's also the bedrock of the Book of Mormon. Adding to this was that the Smiths had a huge involvement in civic responsibility and pushed against taxes and religious taxes that were the order of the day, including his uncle Jesse, who protested against a religious tax in his town. These ideas of tax bondage come up on the Book of Mormon quite regularly. And of course, they're the basis for a number of wars between the United States and Britain about taxation and representation. One of the single most important things to know about Joseph Smith is that he was incredibly poor. This is their little log cabin, which is in Palmyra, New York, and it is tiny. It has basically 2 rooms on the bottom, a kind of communal kitchen room with a bedroom by the side for the parents and a little outhouse for the girls. And then upstairs in the loft was where all the boys slept. And there are 9 of the children and 2 of the adults. So this is very cramped, 11 people. And they basically had next to nothing. Joseph Smith Sr. married Lucy Mack back in New England, and they were both from fairly wealthy families, farming families who had done fairly well. There were few upsets in the family and a few disasters which talk about that kind of pride cycle scenario, but generally they were fairly well off. And in fact, Lucy got a inheritance, a gift from her brothers to start their family, quite a significant amount. Joseph Smith Sr. had a farm. They pooled their resources and they went trading. But unfortunately, Joseph Smith Sr. did some merchant speculation with ginseng and lost the family fortune, lost the money that Lucy had, and so they were back in abject poverty, living as tenants, going from place to place. And of course, that was disastrous for them, but they were young and they were having children, and it seemed like they were getting back on their feet, and then they got sick. Typhoid came through the area. This affected Sophronia, the oldest daughter, and Joseph Smith Jr., who got a leg infection. Fighting off the medical bills for that, they were in poverty again. And then an eruption in Indonesia caused a summer without heat in New England, and that meant crop failure, which meant the Smiths were warned out of their local town because they were too poor. And Joseph Smith Sr. made the trek to Western New York and brought his family there as a huge migration away from their New England family to try and start again. And starting off a little bit later in life, they again went through some booms and some busts, but they were able to get a property on credit. It was near the township of Palmyra, and they were able to clear some land, but the ailing and aging parents were getting wearisome, and Joseph Smith Sr. was not a great provider. He did some speculative schemes like treasure digging, which often didn't produce much. And so the oldest brother, Alvin, was the one who really took on the charge of the family finances and made it possible for them to make their mortgage payments and to then build a frame house. But when Alvin suddenly died in 1823, this plunged the family back into huge poverty and uncertainty, and Joseph Smith Sr. still was not able to provide well for the family. Lots of mouths. The older brothers, including Hiram and Joseph and even Samuel, were busy trying to provide for the family by contracting out as day laborers, but that was hard work, and also it just didn't yield very much. Joseph Smith Sr. co-opted the younger Joseph into treasure digging, which was incredibly speculative and of course didn't yield much money. And on a treasure dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania in 1825, creditors came knocking at the doors and basically foreclosed on their house, forcing them to a situation where they ended up as tenants on their own land. Hiram got married and tried to support the aging parents. Joseph Smith Jr., for his own right, basically left home and left his parents' problems to them and escaped to Bainbridge in South New York, and also then courting Emma in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And then when he managed to secure her as a wife, he came back to Manchester, Palmyra, and they lived in the Smith home. It was a miserable existence and terrible for Emma, who was from quite a well-to-do family who'd given up everything to elope with Joseph. And so it was pretty dire in 1827 when Joseph started on the project of the Book of Mormon. Absolutely began as a money-making endeavor, a way to provide for the family. And we know this because many reminiscents about the Smiths, including the Smiths' parents, talked about how this was going to save the family from their financial ruin. And of course, the Book of Mormon itself has a number of references to the poor and the downtrodden, the idea that people should provide for them, that sharing is really important, and that you could tell that people were haughty and prideful because they were buoyed up in their apparel, their costly apparel, that was separating them from people who were in need that they should be sharing with. One of the things I think is really underappreciated about Joseph and his life is the various locations that he lived. Joseph grew up in New England, bouncing around a number of states in a small geographical area. This was pretty much ground zero for the American Revolution and also for the War of 1812. Joseph had huge extended family connections that took him all over the place, but also that they were deeply affected by the American Constitution and the idea of a liberty and freedom space that people could inhabit and be able to improve themselves. Then he made a major migration to Western New York, to Palmyra, and this changed his world completely. These were his formative years where he was developing himself as a youth and contributing to the family in numerous ways, including financial. And since the area was the ground zero for revivals, these ideas of religious excitement were incredibly pernicious in that area. This is where he developed folk magic, where his family business of treasure seeking was a part of his daily life. There was also the building of the Erie Canal and completion nearby. There was also big towns like Canandaigua, which were full of industry. Western New York was a hotbed of religious but also economic development. And in the midst of this, they lost their family farm, so they were deep in poverty when many other people were doing well. Then his latter years courting Emma and being married, he spent quite a bit of this time in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and this is where the majority of the Book of Mormon was produced. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, was very deeply religious. He was really interested in religious tolerance and liberty of conscience and the idea that religion underpinned people's lives and their hope. And these are the kinds of things that permeated the community where Joseph was in, including Emma's uncle, who was a Methodist preacher, and the whole wider Hale and Lewis families who were deeply embedded in Christianity. And you can see all of these themes running through the Book of Mormon. You can even see the transitions between those locations. For instance, the migration from New England through to Western New York really mirrors that idea of Lehi leaving Jerusalem and going to the New World, and Joseph fleeing with Emma from Palmyra down to Harmony, Pennsylvania to her parents really mirrors that transition of Mosiah, leaving the land of Nephi-Lehi and going to Zarahemla. And Joseph made a number of trips back and forth from Harmony, Pennsylvania to his parents' house in Palmyra. And so there's those kind of migrations back and forth that we also see in the Book of Mormon, including some geographical features as people migrate back and forth between those spaces, and there are conflicts in the background. One of the things I find fascinating about these particular locations is that they all have their unique, specific ideas that play out in Joseph's life in really interesting ways and into the Book of Mormon. And yet they're also part of a wider understanding of the United States as a new nation, but also its place in the world. And these mean that other people from even outside New England and Western New York and also Pennsylvania also buy into these same kinds of ideas and get captured by the Book of Mormon. So as a real estate agent would say, it's all location, location, location. And certainly these locations meant a great deal to Joseph and the way he viewed the world. When talking about locations and areas that influenced Joseph in his development, one of the places that we don't talk enough about is Harmony, Pennsylvania. And I'd like to recommend this book, Liberty and Harmony, The Story of Joseph Smith in Pennsylvania by Forrest Hanson. I think it's a brilliant book that just talks about the ways that the culture in Pennsylvania really did influence Joseph, and it allowed him to participate in the Book of Mormon. Particularly, it talks about the idea of William Penn and his vision of Pennsylvania being a place of religious tolerance and a place where people could exercise their religion with liberty. That permeated the whole culture of the area and influenced how other people responded to Joseph as he worked on the Book of Mormon. Forrest Hanson makes the case that there would be no Book of Mormon without Harmony, Pennsylvania, in that without the religious tolerance that was available to Joseph in that place, he may not have been able to produce the Book of Mormon. Joseph first came to Harmony, Pennsylvania in November of 1825 when he was hired by Josiah Stowell, who lived in nearby South Bainbridge, which was actually over the border in New York, to come to Harmony with his father, Joseph Smith Sr., to dig for treasure for a gold and silver mine that was on the Susquehanna River. Now, this was nearby the Hales, and Joseph and his father and a few others boarded at the Hales farm while they were searching for this treasure. This was the very comfortable home of the Hale family, and this is where Joseph first met Emma and got very excited about her. You can see from these rooms in the Hale house that they were so much better off financially than the Smiths. Later, when Lucy Mack came to this house, she described it as a mansion. And you can see on the back wall there's a musket, because Isaac Hale was a hunter, and there was lots of wilderness really close to the house, which he used to go and hunt. So they used to have game, they used to use it as a family business to send it down the river to other settlements, and they produced quite a good income, which allowed for this house. The treasure dig was soon abandoned, and Joseph and his father went back to Western New York, where actually they lost their own family home around the same time. In the wake of that disaster, Joseph returned to the area and did some work for Josiah Stowell on his farm and Joseph Knight Sr., and stayed around the area. He also got tried as a glass looker in the 1826 trial, which changed his fortunes quite a bit and maybe his feelings about the whole money digging business. And he went to school in the area. He was an older teenager by this point, but he was supplementing his education by working and going to school. He was also going back and forth to Palmyra, and later in 1826, he came back to the area to try and court Emma. And they eloped in early 1827. Emma was a couple of years older than Joseph and very well-to-do and well-educated, but she saw something in Joseph that she loved, and she went with him across the border into New York, got married without her father's permission, and then effectively went straight to Manchester to live with the Smiths. And so she left her mansion in Harmony, Pennsylvania, to go to Manchester with Joseph and live in a lot less affluence and comfort. This was pretty miserable, and she was very unhappy, and so she wrote to her father about some of her things, and he agreed that she should have them, even though he was so angry at Joseph for taking away his daughter. In fact, some reports suggest that he wanted to kill him. In the fall of 1827, Joseph hired his neighbor, Peter Ingersoll, to drive the couple to Harmony, Pennsylvania to pick up some of Emma's things, and this enacted a reconciliation between Emma and her father, and Isaac then invited the couple to come and live with them, which was fortuitous because Joseph was by this point talking about the Book of Mormon and the plates, and there was a number of persecutions in Palmyra which allowed them to kind of escape and come back down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, in which the Book of Mormon production started. Isaac was not happy about the idea of these golden plates and the idea of seer stones. He just totally did not believe, but also he felt like it was just part of this treasure digging con. So the couple moved to this cabin not very far away from the main house and lived apart from the parents. Here, Isaac hoped that Joseph would make a go of farming, just this little farmlet here, so that they would have enough and that the parents didn't have to support them. I'm going to tell you a wild story, so buckle up. Many of you will recognize this monument, which is the Angel Moroni monument on the top of the Hill Cumorah in Manchester, New York. This is where, in the early hours of the 22nd of September, 1827, Joseph got the golden plates, or so he says. And this, of course, was the night of the equinox, because this was the time that Moroni appeared to Joseph and told him about the plates, and he'd been tutoring for 4 years before he was able to receive it. And he was able to receive it because he brought the right person to the hill that night, and that person was Emma Hale. Joseph and Emma had eloped in early 1827 and had come to live in Manchester with the Smith family, and they lived in this frame house which Alvin had kind of started building before he died. And by this point in 1827, the Smiths had lost their family farm and were just tenants, but they were allowed to live there and subsequently had to move out and back to the log house a little bit later. But at this particular point in time, they were in the frame house. And there was a lot more room in this house than there was in the log cabin, but not a lot of privacy. Now, you can imagine as a newlywed living with your parents and your siblings, then there might not be lots of opportunity to engage in sex and being able to enjoy being married. So as it was in the early hours of September 22nd, 1827, Joseph and Emma, dressed in black, borrowed Joseph Knight Sr.'s buggy, they were also staying at the frame house that night, and stole off into the night. And wouldn't you know it, that Emma became pregnant and 9 months later had a child. When you think of retrieving the plates that particular night, nobody thinks of the idea that Joseph and Emma had sex on the Kilcamora. It wasn't very long afterwards that Joseph and Emma were able to relocate to Harmony, Pennsylvania, because Emma was pregnant, and the family, the parents particularly, wanted to have a connection to their grandchild. Here is the bed that they properly slept in the Hale house, because it was downstairs close to the hearth where they could get some heat over that winter. Joseph wanted to work on the Book of Mormon, and Isaac Hale was opposed to that. Isaac moved them to a little log cabin nearby. But what's really curious is that when you go back and look at the Hales and the Lewises and what they talk about in relation to Joseph Smith a little bit later, one of the things they talk about is the idea that Joseph told them that the child that Emma was carrying was a special child that would bring forth the Book of Mormon, and this would be a special witness of a miracle that would allow people to know that it was from God. This particular story had a tragic end because the child died. Here's the headstone just a few feet away from the little log cabin in the local cemetery where a lot of the Hale family are. This is a new headstone, and you can see in the back they've put the old headstone that it was made out of copper. The inscription reads, "In memory of an infant son of Joseph and Emma Smith, born June 15th, 1828. And it's hard to know whether the child was born stillbirth or just survived for a few hours, but it was a devastating loss, and it was a heartbreaking time for the couple. Family folklore is that the child was named Alvin after Joseph's loved brother who died in 1823. This loss, along with the loss of the original manuscript with Martin Harris, was a pivotal time for Joseph. It changed the whole trajectory of the Book of Mormon, because up until this point it was much like an adventure story. It had these mystic elements like a magical miracle child, but it also had that idea that it was going to be for profit. And yet in this moment of agony and loss, Joseph pivoted and it became a much more spiritual project. As Emma's parents put up with the couple because they were having a grandchild, they then put up with the couple again because of this devastating loss. They even almost lost their daughter Emma because she was so sick after the birth. This meant that they stayed in Harmony, Pennsylvania for another year before they left for Fayette, New York on the 1st of June, 1829. So part of the treasure from the Book of Mormon coming forth was the idea of this child, and this devastating loss changed the trajectory of the Book of Mormon and Joseph and Emma's life. One of the problems we have about reconstructing Joseph's life and understanding what he was thinking and his influences is that he never wrote anything down. So we only have reminiscences from other people about his early life, particularly prior to the Book of Mormon. We know that Joseph was in Harmony, Pennsylvania, living on the Hale farm from the end of 1827 through to June of 1829. So quite a significant time, and this is a major part of the Book of Mormon production. And this was his father-in-law, Isaac Hale, Emma's dad. Now we know that he did not like or trust Joseph, and he said so on many occasions, including an affidavit in 1834. But we don't know what Joseph thought of Isaac, because there's just not much in the historical record, and in the few instances there are, he talks about Isaac as having protected him in harmony. And given that Joseph was really keen on having close relationships with other men and the respect that came with other men, it's likely that Joseph actually really respected Isaac. His home was beautiful. He was a safe, self-made man. He was different than his own father, and he treated his daughter with love and kindness and an incredible amount of affection. Joseph first met Isaac Hale when he boarded with him in November of 1825 on a treasure dig for Josiah Stowell. But Isaac Hale remembers that time as being one of conflict between Joseph's dad and himself. It's likely that Joseph saw the disparity between his relationship and his own father with the relationship that Isaac had with his family, particularly Emma. Isaac was a deeply religious man. His wife's brother, Nathaniel, was the local Methodist preacher, and there is family folklore that he came across his daughter Emma praying in the woods and was converted by her sincere prayers. I think it's highly likely that Isaac Hale is responsible for the switching of the Book of Mormon project with Martin Harris to be more of a spiritual project with Oliver Cowdery. Living just a few feet from each other, Joseph and Isaac would have interacted a lot, and there were a number of challenging things that happened during this 18-month period when Joseph was living in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He'd lost the original manuscript, they'd lost their son, Alvin, and there was a quandary about whether Joseph could actually produce. In August of 1828, Joseph tried to join the family Methodist church, but was rebuffed by some of Emma's cousins. These failures, all at around the same time, I think changed Joseph's heart and really pushed him towards a more spiritual version of this Christian adventure story. And Isaac's call for Joseph to repent on a number of fronts, one as a dutiful husband and another as a kind of treasure seeker who needed reform, forced Joseph into change. And if we take the Book of Mormon as autobiographical, I think you see this in the case of Abinadi preaching to the king Noah and Alma being converted by his words, because I think that the character Abinadi is embodied in Isaac Hale, and the character of King Noah is embodied in Joseph's own father, Joseph Smith Sr. And that tension between deciding between your natural father and king and your spiritual father, your father-in-law, Isaac Hale, I think is that embodiment of that story. Joseph, like Alma, gave up prominence in his father's court, in King Noah's court, in order to side with the idea of being a righteous leader. Isaac Hale was also a great hunter. It was part of the family business. And these things ended up in the Book of Mormon with the creation of a nature preserve in the south, which Zarahemla has talked about, and also the idea of Enos going into the woods to pray after he's hunting, the idea that he got a spiritual witness, just like Isaac Hale did when he saw his daughter Emma pray. And while Isaac and Joseph were never friends, and Isaac never trusted Joseph, it's likely that Joseph had a huge respect for his father-in-law and wanted to be like him, and at the very least have his approval. The Hale homestead in Harmony, Pennsylvania is an important location because that is where the vast majority of the Book of Mormon was produced. This is the main room in Joseph and Emma's cabin, not far from the parents, just a few feet away. It's surrounded by a bit of land, which meant that there needed to be a couple of people there to maintain it. And Samuel Smith came and worked with Joseph to make sure that the outside stuff was being done so that basically he could focus on the Book of Mormon. The original production of the Book of Mormon happened in early 1828, and Emma was likely the first scribe. There's also some indication that Reuben Hale, Emma's brother, was also a scribe, and perhaps even Alva. But the main scribe in 1828, from April the 12th through to June the 14th, was Martin Harris. This part of the manuscript was taken by Martin Harris to Palmyra to convince his wife Lucy, in which time the Smiths were dealing with the idea that they were having a baby in a couple of days' time, and of course that baby, Alvin, died. Emma also almost died during the process, so was very sick for a number of weeks, but according to Lucy Mack Smith, she compelled her husband to go back to Palmyra to retrieve the manuscript because she was so worried. And of course, when he got there and addressed Martin Harris, the manuscript was lost. The production of the Book of Mormon didn't start again until early 1829. A couple of things to know from this time frame where Emma and Martin were scribing for Joseph. Emma describes the process as Joseph bearing his head in a hat, looking at a seer stone and reciting words which were then copied down. She also talks about how she used to move the plates around covered in a cloth, and that she never saw them. Neither did Martin. Martin also had the situation where they'd go down to the river to skip rocks, and he chose a rock that was very much like Joseph's seer stone and put it in the hat to see if he could produce anything. And Joseph, discovering the deception, played along and was able to convince Martin that this seer stone that he had was indeed very special. When the Book of Mormon dictation started again in early 1829, Emma probably scribed first, and then we see that Martin came to visit in March, and he probably did a little bit of scribing as well. The dictation started off with Mosiah because Joseph was still hopeful he'd be able to recover the lost manuscript, and he worked on from then. And then Oliver Cowdery came on the 5th of April, 1829. Joseph had originally asked for Samuel to come and help him, especially around the farm or as a scribe, so that he could work on the Book of Mormon, and Oliver coming was really a bonus. Joseph was having problems with his father-in-law Isaac and his insistence that he work on the farm, and he really wanted to work on the Book of Mormon. So what Oliver did was he allowed Joseph to purchase the farm, or at least put a down payment on the farm, so that Isaac Hale would be off Joseph's back. That agreement was signed on April the 6th, 1829, a full year before the beginning of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then on the 7th of April, Oliver became the main scribe and did so right through to the end of May, the beginning of June, when they transferred from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York. By May 1829, things got quite bad for Oliver and Joseph. And so Oliver sent a letter to his friend David Whitmer asking for help, and David came and relocated the family through to Fayette, New York on the 1st of June, 1829. Whitmer farm was very crowded, but they managed to carve out a little bit of space where they could do some dictation upstairs near the bedroom, but it was pretty exposed. People could hear what was going on, and there was a lot of involvement from the Whitmers, including them being some of the scribes. Joseph had hoped to recover the lost manuscript from Martin Harris, but that didn't happen, so it needed to be recreated with a new portion, and this all happened at the Whitmer farm. But by the end of June, it was pretty much finished, and it was arranged for printing. Joseph's seer stone was a big part of this, and his brown egg-shaped stone was the one that was used in the dictation process. But there were others that he had. There's a story about him traveling to Lake Erie to discover a seer stone. And there are actually places along Lake Erie where you can find these kind of egg-shaped stones. So that's where I picked up my seer stone to take it to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to try it in Joseph's hat. I'm sad to report that it didn't show me anything that I didn't already know, and that is, this is just a pet rock. There was no such thing as Joseph Smith's first vision, or at least not how he represented it later in his life. Happy New Year, and welcome to Come Follow Me as we go through the Doctrine and Covenants, and the first lesson is on the first vision. And yet, what we know about the first vision is it doesn't add up. The 1838 account of Joseph's first vision is the one that's canonized in the Pearl of Great Price. And in it, it tells you a few details about the circumstance leading up to the first vision. And one of the most important ones is in verse 7, where it says, "At this time in my 15th year, my father's family was proselyted to the Presbyterian church, and 4 of them joined that church." Now, yes, Joseph's 15th year would have roughly been 1820. But the year the revival was on, and when Lucy Mack and the children Hiram and Sophronia and Samuel joined the Presbyterian Church, was 1824. There is no revival in 1820. There is a revival in 1824, and there's no members of the family joining the Presbyterian Church in 1820, but there is family joining the church in 1824. And this is after the angel has come and talked about the golden plates, after Alvin Smith has died. And nobody makes mention of this event. Lucy Mack Smith doesn't talk about it in her history. None of the family relate this. None of the family tell about the idea that Joseph has seen a vision and knows that other churches are incorrect. But because Joseph Smith Jr. sides with his father, Joseph Smith Sr., against going to these organized religions and joining the Presbyterian Church, that is the basis by which Lucy explains Joseph not going to the same church as she is. And there certainly isn't any pushback on Joseph about having seen a vision in 1820 or even 1823 for that matter. But that doesn't mean that Joseph didn't have a spiritual conversion. It probably just didn't happen the way that he describes later in 1820. He may have felt very close and connected to religion and wanted to know more about it, but it certainly wasn't a first vision in 1820, and it certainly wasn't in 1824 even. But chances are it probably was in 1828, because after Martin Harris lost the initial manuscript and Joseph and Emma had lost their baby son, things were pretty dire and he felt rebuked. He needed to change, and so he had a spiritual witness, at least some kind of conversion where he did a massive 180. And so here's a first vision account in Enos, where Enos goes into the woods. He's convicted of his sins, he prays, and he finds forgiveness. And this is because of his faith in Christ. When Joseph related his conversion experience for the first time in 1832 in his history, he used the same kinds of understandings and words as Enos, the idea that he cried unto the Lord, that he was suing for mercy, and that the Lord forgave him of his sins. It had the added understanding that Joseph saw Jesus, but this was something that also was baked into the Book of Mormon. Nephi saw Jesus, and Mormons saw Jesus, particularly at young ages. And also, Trevor Larson talks about how, Lehi had a very similar kind of first vision kind of experience. And if 1828 is the time that this actually happened, this would be in keeping with Joseph being in Harmony, Pennsylvania, with Nathaniel Lewis, Emma's uncle, as a Methodist preacher. And we know from some of his later accounts that he and Joseph argued about some of these things. And this means that the Joseph Smith history is kind of based on the idea that a Methodist preacher would push back on these ideas of visions and spiritual gifts, because that is exactly what Nathaniel Lewis was doing to Joseph Smith Jr. in Harmony. So this grove of trees, which is designated the first vision site in Palmyra, is probably not where Joseph received this kind of conversion. It's probably a very similar grove of trees right next to the Harmony farm in Pennsylvania. And this mighty conversion experience probably happened in 1828 when Joseph was 22, not when he was 15 or 14. And because it came after the angel experience, it's been backdated beforehand. And of course, none of the first members of the church related to the first vision at all. It was really about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Lucy Mack Smith didn't mention the first vision in her account of Joseph Smith's history. Nobody gave much prominence to an idea of a first vision right up until 1880, when they were trying to get rid of the idea of polygamy and needed some other foundational understanding. And of course, the differences between the 1832 account and the 1838 account and other accounts suggest that Joseph's understanding of the nature of God was evolving. The 1832 account is very much more consistent with what the nature of God is in the Book of Mormon. And the 1838 account is much more consistent with Joseph's later innovations about God and Jesus being separate and tangible much later in the Nauvoo period. So the idea of a very young Joseph praying in the woods is not likely a reality. It's probably a much older Joseph who has come to understand a lot more about God and want to have some kind of remission from his sins.